Electronic Arts, often shorthanded as EA, was founded in 1982 in California by a former Apple employee named Trip Hawkins, who also went on to found the ill-fated 3DO company, which made video game hardware, and the somewhat more prolific but also ultimately ill-fated casual game developer Digital Chocolate. EA, though, has been an absolutely astounding success. Its business model was predicated on the premise of selling video games directly to retailers, rather than going through intermediaries. This allowed them to gain more market share than their competitors right off the bat, and it helped them glean higher margins than their competitors from each direct sale, too. EA also established an early reputation for treating its developers really well. They were the first gaming company to feature their developers in advertising and to give them platforms, promoting them as video game artists, basically, and it shared the profits netted from those direct sales with these developers, which in turn meant all the best developers really wanted to work for EA, which led to a beneficial cycle where they created better and more financially successful games. In the late 80s, they started deviating from this model somewhat, scooping up a collection of successful independent game development studios and deviating at times from the creative lead's vision when releasing the games. They also refocused a fair bit of their resources on franchises, like the immensely successful, as it turned out, Madden NFL series, and they branched out into producing games for the console market, including the still new, at that point, Nintendo Entertainment System in 1990. That same year, EA went public on the NASDAQ. The company got new leadership when Hawkins decided to refocus on his far less successful 3DO hardware startup, and in an interesting twist, the arrival of the Sony PlayStation in North America caused EA to drop support for 3DO hardware in the mid-90s so it could refocus on PlayStation games, which were a lot more lucrative. By the mid-90s, EA had an astonishingly large and successful software library, including franchises like the aforementioned Madden games and the FIFA soccer games, but also celebrity-tied games like Shaq Fu and military-themed shooters like Jungle Strike and Urban Strike. By the early 2000s, EA was making exclusive licensing deals with the NFL and ESPN in order to stave off newfound sports game competitors, and it was the only video game company to consistently make a profit, most others experiencing feast and famine cycles with periodic wins, but a whole lot of losses they had to cover with the profits from those wins. EA, in contrast, had a reliable stable of profit sources, and it thus had a whole lot of leverage in terms of attracting and retaining talent, but also getting big names and brands on board for collaborative projects. What I'd like to talk about today is what happened to EA during and following the 2008 economic crisis, and how and why it recently became an acquisition target for Saudi Arabia. You're listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. I'm able to keep this show ad-free because of support from listeners like you. If you're finding value in what I'm doing here, consider becoming a paid supporter for the cost of a cup of coffee each month at letsknowthings.com. And as a thank you for your helping me keep this show solvent, you'll receive an additional bonus More Things episode each month. All right, let's get back to the show. In 2008, when the global economy was collapsing, EA suffered a bad holiday sales season and fired 1,100 employees and closed 12 of their facilities early the following year. Later in 2009, the company announced the firing of another 1,500 employees, which was about 17% of their total workforce at the time. And in 2010, they acquired a gaming company that focused on mobile games, which were becoming increasingly popular now that many people had touch-capable smartphones, which brought hot new franchises like Angry Birds under their brand umbrella. On the strength of that acquisition and all those downsizings, in early 2011, EA announced that it hit $3.8 billion in revenue in the financial year for the first time, and in early 2012, it announced it surpassed $1 billion in digital revenue during the previous year, which was a huge figure that early in the digital media landscape. It used some of those profits to scoop up another mobile-first gaming company, adding properties like Plants vs. Zombies and Peggle to their library. EA completed another mass firing in 2013, dismissing 10% of their employees under what they called a reorganization. Around the same time, they announced an exclusive license with Disney that would allow them to develop Star Wars games. Their stock value boomed in the following years as a result of those cost savings measures and those new relationships. And emboldened by record high stock valuations, in the mid-2010s, the company started releasing big-name games like Star Wars Battlefront 2 with random content loot boxes and other sorts of microtransactions inside the game. This did not go over well with players who decried these in-game purchasing options as pay-to-win mechanics, as players could pay more money to get better characters and equipment, and a lot of the content, even after paying for the expensive games themselves, was still locked behind paywalls, requiring more payments to unlock that content. A bunch of gaming journalists cried foul on this shift as the game careened toward its full release, as did a whole lot of early players, and eventually Disney complained too. So by the time it hit shelves, the game's loot system was substantially changed. But that whole controversy spooked investors and led to an 8.5% stock value drop in just a single month, knocking $3.1 billion from the company's valuation. As a result of that controversy, EA also became the face for a larger legal and legislative debate about in-game purchases and how it's kinda sorta like gambling at times, and how that might be an issue, especially when aimed at children. Soon after, EA experienced a series of bad quarters, including a huge drop of 13.3% to its valuation when a major entry in one of their larger franchises, Battlefield 5, was released late and received very mixed reviews when it was released, which led to 1 million fewer sold copies than anticipated. The game was also lagging in terms of gameplay behind smaller, nimbler competitors that were popping out of the woodwork, including then burgeoning Fortnite. The company saw an overall boost with the surprise success of Apex Legends, and the COVID-19 pandemic further boosted sales, and pretty dramatically for a while there, since everyone was staying home, which allowed EA to gobble up a few more competing companies with successful franchises of their own, and they knocked out a few more successful Star Wars games during that period as well. In early 2021, Saudi Arabia's public investment fund bought 7.4 million shares of EA for about $1.1 billion, which is unusual, and it flew under the radar for most gamers, but remember, that happened in 2021, and that will be important in a moment. Later that year, the company experienced a massive hack, and a lot of its data, including the source code for games, was stolen and sold on the dark web. EA bought some more competitors, but word on the street in 2022 was that the higher-ups at EA were quietly shopping the company around, looking to themselves be acquired by a larger entity, something on the scale of Apple or Disney. In early 2023, the company announced more mass layoffs and launched another internal reorganization. It gutted several of its most popular gaming sub-brands, including BioWare. It canceled an upcoming Star Wars game, and it announced that it would be shifting away from licensing agreements and refocusing on EA-owned intellectual property. The pattern of layoffs leading to better financial fortunes did not pay off this time, though. In early 2025, EA divulged that it expected to underperform in the coming year, several of its big-name titles not having done as well as expected. The company cast blame on the market, among other things, but players and journalists pointed at the company's consistent gutting of its big-name studios and the firing of many of its veteran developers, in order to save money, to explain those reduced sales. EA had another mass firing in April of this year, and that was followed by another in May, which paralleled an announcement that they would no longer be moving forward with a big planned Black Panther game. In late September of 2025, EA announced that it had reached a deal worth $55 billion to go private, no longer selling shares on the stock market, buying up all those shares basically, with the financial assistance of a group of investors, which included Affinity Partners, which is led by Jared Kushner, US President Trump's son-in-law, Silver Lake, which is a US-based private equity firm that helps make these sorts of big sales happen, and the aforementioned Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund. This deal is not done yet. It still needs to get regulatory approval and a successful vote by stockholders, but it seems likely to go through since the US regulatory environment is pretty lax at the moment, and because Kushner is involved, it is unlikely President Trump will take a personal disliking to it. But the big story here seems to be that Saudi Arabia is buying up not just a video game company, but one of the biggest and most successful video game companies in the world, which, although it has lost a lot of credibility with fans over the years, it still owns some massively influential intellectual property and has just a stunning number of relationships and connections throughout the media world alongside its huge valuation. If the sale does go through, and we should know for sure by sometime around June of 2026, it would be the largest ever leveraged buyout, which means the purchase was completed by using borrowed money that was borrowed against the asset being purchased. So those investors have taken out debt, have taken out a loan against EA itself, which is an increasingly common means of buying a large asset on the cheap. But it also typically burdens that asset with a simply astounding amount of debt, which must then be recouped, often by selling off undervalued assets or other such financial trickery. When this happens to a newspaper that is purchased as a leveraged buyout, for instance, the buyer will often sell off the paper's real estate and fire all their employees to make money and pay off that debt. And in this case, there is a chance that debt will be paid off by throwing up a bunch of new paywalls and really leaning into those in-game transactions that nobody really liked, including politicians back in the day. Some of them wanted to pass laws against it, and in some places, those laws were actually passed, at least at a lightweight level, but which in this current regulatory environment would probably be allowed, and they would probably make some serious bank off of it initially, before players started getting wise and moving on to other games released by less predatory companies. The really interesting facet of this story, though, is the question of why Saudi Arabia wants to own a video game company. And to understand that, it's important to understand that first, the country's public investment fund is, ostensibly at least, meant to help its economy shift away from purely extractive enterprises like oil companies, and it has thus invested in all sorts of things, including luxury beach resorts, taking out minority stakes in financial service companies like Citigroup, taking out stakes in companies like Disney and Boeing and Meta, and increasingly making investments in companies run by allies of President Trump, like the aforementioned Affinity Partners, which was formed by Jared Kushner. So this is an economic play, but it's also partly a political play, almost certainly by the Saudis, to get in good with the people who are in good with the US government and probably other governments around the world as well. It's also been alleged that this might be an attempt by the Saudis to engage in what's being called game washing, which is similar to greenwashing, but instead of trying to make a company seem greener and more sustainable than it is by doing kind of sort of green-seeming things, but only as a veneer to cover up the opposite that they're also doing, in this case it means using sports and video games and other similar pastimes to increase a nation's reputation with humanistic-seeming stuff, despite the truth being much more complicated and, in some cases, the opposite of that. Just as when the Saudi fund participated in buying a Premier League football, that is soccer for American audiences, team back in 2021 then, and alongside their concomitant establishment of LIV Golf, a golf league meant to compete with the PGA, this investment in EA and other investments of this kind that it has made in video game companies like Capcom and Nexon might all be part of a larger effort to diversify the nation's brand, not just its economics. Saudi Arabia's human rights record is abysmal, and it is possible that they are trying to cover that up, to put a new coat of paint over it, to make people forget about all of that by creating more connections between Saudi Arabia and positive stuff like sports and video games, things people like. There are additional concerns about this purchase of EA too, by the way, because Saudi Arabia's cultural values are very traditional conservative, very anti-woman, very anti-LGBTQ, very anti-liberal democratic values. So there are fears that we might see less representation and fewer of what we might call Western values portrayed and or celebrated in the games released by these studios as a result of this ownership. Now, the folks running EA have said that their core values will remain unchanged by the buyout, but it is expected, bare minimum, that this purchase will lead to another several restructurings and probably mass layoffs throughout the company in the coming years to help recoup all that debt, at the end of which there's a non-zero chance that the people making those promises could be long gone. The book I'd like to recommend today is called Bandwidth: The Untold Story of Ambition, Deception, and Innovation That Shaped the Internet Age and .com Boom by Dan Caruso. This is one of those interesting modern history books that popped up on my radar and that I had to read immediately because it pointed at a moment and time and a huge bubble that emerged that I hadn't ever really thought about. And that was the bubble that emerged before and to a certain point at the beginning of the .com bubble, related to the deployment of fiber optic cable and the expansion of internet infrastructure across the United States and across the world, all of which was required for the internet to happen, for the .com bubble to happen, for everything that happened afterwards to happen, and in part because of the way that it happened, with this huge surge of investment, and then a whole lot of the early companies that were investing grand sums of money in this deployment going under, and then their assets being bought up at fire sale prices later. That was all required for the world that we live in today to look the way that it does, for better and for worse. Now, if any of that sounds interesting to you, the way that it sounded interesting to me, consider picking up a copy of Bandwidth by Dan Caruso. Let's Know Things is a listener-supported show. I don't make any money from ads, only what listeners contribute by becoming paid supporters at letsknowthings.com. If you're not in the position to become a paid supporter at the moment, consider leaving a quick review wherever you get your pods. Those help get the show in front of more people and lend a hint of credibility to independently made shows like this one. A huge thanks in advance, whatever shape your support might take.